Tinseltown, Murder, Morphine, and Madness at the Dawn of Hollywood. And that's one of those titles, I just had to pick it up and I had to read it. I mean, it kind of screams reading. And I wasn't disappointed. The author is William J. Mann, and he specializes in books about Hollywood and the film industry. But a few years ago, he wrote a book called The Wars of the Roosevelts, which is about all the feuds between the Teddy Roosevelt section of the family and the FDR section. Sort of a gossipy little book. But as Cokie Roberts once said, gossip is history. So you might want to check it out. This book was published in 2014, was a New York Times bestseller. It was named by NPR as one of the best books of the year, and it received the Edgar Award for Best True Crime Book. Now, I like this book because it's about the silent era Hollywood, and I think that's a really interesting time. And it introduces you to a lot of silent era personalities. One reviewer described it as Day of the Locust meets The Devil in White City and Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And I would throw a little Sunset Boulevard in there too, on the, just to be on the accurate side. Has anybody read Devil Locust? By Nathaniel West, novel written, I think, in the 30s. It reminded me a lot of this. It's a novel, but it's set in Hollywood about a decade later in the 30s, kind of the underside of Hollywood. This book is about a murder in 1922 Hollywood of a fairly prominent director of the silent era. And in 1922, the film industry has kind of become a force to be reckoned with. In 2 decades, it's grown from a sideshow attraction, the Nickelodeon, to the 4th largest industry in the country. Millions of Americans every week plunk down their nickels and dimes for the price of a movie ticket. And young people are particularly enamored of movies. They emulate the behavior of their favorite movie stars. When Rudolph Valentino slicks back his hair, young men go home, get the lard out, and try to approximate his look. And when Clara Bow bobs her hair and shortens her skirts, young women want to do the same. Interesting story about Clara Bow. She had red hair. She has a custom-made convertible painted to match her hair, and then she has her dogs dyed to match her hair and her convertible. Now, not everybody is as crazy about the movies as many Americans are. There's a certain faction, you might call them a silent era moral majority, that objects to the movies. They don't like the influence it has, particularly on young people. In fact, they think the movies are just kind of downright evil. And there's a cartoon in a religious publication that shows the devil himself standing behind the movie camera turning the film. What they want is government censorship of the movies. Now, the movie industry doesn't want that at all. They think that'll be a death knell to their thriving industry. So they're determined not to let that happen. But in the early 20s, there were several scandals that kind of give fodder to the anti-movie faction. There's an actress named Olive Thomas. She's married to an actor named Jack Pickford, both very popular. Jack contracts syphilis. He's given something called mercury bichloride to treat his sores topically. She gets drunk and ingests this accidentally. It's very corrosive, and it just literally eats her insides out over the course of several days, and she dies a horrible, agonizing death. And this all plays out in the newspapers. And then there's an actor named Wallace Reed, very popular leading man type. He gets an injury on the set, and he's prescribed opiates for the pain. He becomes addicted and dies of an overdose. And then sort of the biggest scandal of the day is the Fatty Arbuckle scandal. Fatty Arbuckle is the leading comedic actor of the time. He attends a party in 1921, and he's accused of raping a young starlet, and because of his massive body weight, he's accused of crushing her to death. He's tried 3 times. The first 2 trials are mistrials. On the 3rd trial, he's acquitted with an apology from the jury. This should have never happened. It doesn't matter. His life and his career are ruined. So the last thing the movie industry needs is another high-profile scandal. But on the morning of February 2nd, 1922, that's exactly what they got. It's a cold morning in Los Angeles, and at 7:30 in the morning, a man named Henry Peavy shows up for work at the home of his boss, William Desmond Taylor, a well-known director. Now, Henry is what you would call a personal assistant, man Friday valet, if you will. He lets himself into the apartment, and he senses that something's off. Calls his boss's name, no reply. And then he goes into the apartment a little ways, and he sees his boss laying on the floor. He assumes he's fallen, passed out, tries to revive him, and pretty well realizes that he's dead. So Henry gets hysterical, runs out of the apartment, screaming, "Murder, murder, murder." And before you know it, the apartment is filled with friends and neighbors, completely contaminating the crime scene. And pretty soon, movie studio personnel show up, and they start to clean up the apartment. They remove anything they think might be embarrassing to Taylor and the studio. This includes any kind of correspondence, any letters, and any booze, because it is prohibition. Now, at one point, a man claiming to be a doctor shows up, looks at Taylor and says, "Well, he's got his son at Cambridge," and leaves and is never heard from again. So finally, the police arrive. They bring a medical examiner. He discovers that Taylor has died from a single gunshot wound, most likely from a small caliber weapon fired at close range. So now the police start to try to figure out what happened. They examine the body. He seems to be in an almost relaxed position on his back. And he appears to be wearing quite a bit of expensive jewelry, has quite a bit of cash in his pocket, and nothing from the apartment, nothing of value from the apartment seems to be missing. So they assume it's not robbery, but something more personal. So now they have to figure out who might have murdered William Desmond Taylor and why. Now, who was William Desmond Taylor? He was born William Dean Tanner in 1872 in County Carlow, Ireland. And he was born to something called Anglo-Irish gentry. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but... And when he's a young man, he comes to the United States because he wants to be a cowboy, which is apparently a fad among men of his acquaintance. So he comes to the United States, he works on a dude ranch, and then works at several different jobs. And in about 1901, he meets a wealthy young socialite named Ethel May Hamilton. They get married, and her father sets him up as a high-end antique dealer. The marriage seems happy. They have a daughter. And then in about 1908, he just vanishes. He deserts his family with no warning, no reason. And he starts to move west. And as he moves west, he works at a variety of jobs, gold miner, stage actor, and he also changes his name from William Dean Tanner to William Desmond Taylor. So he ends up in Los Angeles, and he starts work as an actor in the early film industry. And in about 1917, he joins the Canadian Army, serves in World War I, comes back to LA, he starts work as a director, and he becomes a well-respected director. So is there something in that time from the time he deserted his family till he was murdered that might have account for his murder? So the police start to cast about and look at all the people who are associated with William Desmond Taylor. Now, who's the first person that you usually ask? Police usually question in a murder. Spouse. Well, he didn't have a spouse at the time. The person that finds the body. Yeah. Well, so they question Henry Peavy. Now, Henry has probably two reasons to really be nervous when the police start to question him. He's black and he's gay. And flamboyantly gay, openly gay. And in an era when it wasn't always, helpful to be either one, or both. And he had recently been arrested for something called lewd vagrancy. It doesn't say what that was, but the author speculates that he was either trying to solicit partners in a public park, or maybe just had to go to the bathroom and there was no place else to go for a black man in 1922. And Taylor had vowed to vouch for him at the trial if there was one. So the police quickly realize that Henry's not a likely suspect. He's genuinely grieved for it because his boss is dead. And the only thing that's gained him is unemployment. So the next person they talk to, who's the next person you talk to in a murder investigation? If you rule out the person that finds the body.
Girlfriend?
Well, or maybe the last person that sees the deceased alive. And that was Mabel Normand. Mabel Normand is kind of like the queen of comedy of the day. She was born on Staten Island in 1893, and by the time she's a teenager, she's become a very popular photographer and artist model. And this leads to work in early film. And when the film industry relocates to California, she follows. By the way, does anybody know why the film industry relocated to California? I didn't know until I read this book. Yeah, but there was a little more. Everything in early film had to be filmed outside because artificial lighting wasn't sufficient to light an interior scene. So even the interiors had to be filmed outside or inside with a retractable or a glass roof. New York doesn't have that, has a lot of cloudy, overcast days. California affords a lot more opportunities for the sun. So I thought that was interesting. So Mabel moves out to California, to Los Angeles, gets parts in films, and she shows a real flair for comedy. And she and William Desmond Taylor become fast friends. Now, a lot of people suspect that there is a romance there, but by all accounts, it's a platonic relationship. They confide in each other. They have the same taste in literature and books. And Mabel often says, I just feel so much better after I have a talk with my Billy. So on the night of the murder, Mabel comes to William Desmond Taylor's apartment. It's early in the evening. She goes inside. They have a couple of drinks of gin and orange juice. She plays a couple of songs on the piano. He loans her a couple of books, and she leaves. This is about 7:30, and as she's being chauffeured away, she blows him a kiss out the back of the car, and he waves at her from the door. Police think William Desmond Taylor was murdered around 8 p.m. She was literally, other than the killer, the last person to see him alive. So they question Mabel pretty vigorously and realize she's not likely a suspect. So then they move on to the next person, and that is an actress named Mary Miles Minter. Mary is about 20 years old, pretty, blonde, plays the ingenue. She's billed as a new Mary Pickford. Taylor's directed her in a number of films, and she has a habit of falling in love with her much older directors, and she does this with William Desmond Taylor. And he makes it clear that he's not interested in her. Other directors have kind of taken advantage of her. And when he tells her that, no, Mary, I just don't think of you that way, you're more like a daughter, this sort of just inflames her passion. She thinks, oh, he's not going to abuse me, so he must really love me. So she writes him all these letters, signed with X's and O's, and comes to his apartment and tells him she can't live without him. And when she hears that he's dead, she goes in hysterics. She goes to the funeral home and demands to see his body and says she'll give him a blood transfusion, even though he's been dead for 24 hours. So the police consider that, well, maybe Mary Miles Minter went and shot him in a fit of jealous rage, or maybe she went there to kill herself and ended up accidentally killing him. But I think they pretty well realized that she was in a different part of town at the time of the murder. So they kind of ruled her out as a suspect too. But then this leads to her mother, Charlotte Shelby. I said that fast 3 times, by the way. Mrs. Shelby is what you might call the stage mother from hell. You've heard of these horrible stage mothers in history. Judy Garland's mother, Ginger Rogers' mother. They would have to hold this lady's beer like this. She pushed her daughter out on the stage at an early age on vaudeville. And in order to get her daughter to allow her daughter to work more and to get more adult parts, she fakes her daughter's age with the birth certificate of a dead niece. Mary Miles Minter is actually the niece's name. Her real name was Juliet Riley. And when little Mary wants to play with her dolls, Mama burns them up because she wants her daughter to appear older. Now, Charlotte Shelby has made it plain that any man that trifles with her daughter is going to suffer her wrath. And she had threatened other directors in the past. It's possible that she believes that Mary Miles and William Desmond Taylor are romantically linked, and maybe she went and took him out. The police consider her a strong possibility. Now, the next person they consider a possible suspect is a man named Edward Sands or Edward Snyder. He's a former valet of William Desmond Taylor before Henry Peavy. And they had parted on not such good terms. Once when Taylor was out of town, Sands wrecks his car, steals jewelry, and forges checks. So Taylor fires him. But on one occasion, he returns and burglarizes Taylor's apartment. So police think maybe it's possible he came back to steal more, surprise Taylor, resulting in Taylor's death. And he remains a strong suspect. Now, the next person is never considered a suspect at the time. But later, writers, authors, bloggers have considered her a possible suspect. And her name is Margaret Gibby Gibson. She's a young actress, about 27 years old, minor parts, but she aspires to be a big-time actress. And she worked with Taylor on several occasions. And just before the murder, she's arrested in a known house of prostitution and an opium den. Now, she says she was just there to soak up some local color for a part, but that's kind of doubtful. But she hires a good attorney, and she's acquitted of the charges. A lot of people believe the studio hired the attorney to avoid some negative publicity. So in order to kind of get away from the scandal, she decides to change her name and change her hair and start over again. So she changes her hair and renames herself Patricia Palmer. Now that seems a little far-fetched, but in the silent era it wouldn't have been. Obviously there's no voices, and then silent films were only shown for a short period of time, put on a shelf where they most likely deteriorated. 90% of all silent films are gone forever. So she never comes on the police's radar or the press's radar, and it's only later, after the fact, years later, that she becomes a suspect. So watching all of this, with a lot of Maylocks moments, is the head of the studio, Adolph Zucker. He's a lot paranoid and he's very ambitious. He wants to be the biggest of the movie moguls. He wants the biggest office and the biggest skyscraper. And he wants to control the movie industry. And he knows that if government censorship is imposed, that will kind of end his ambitions, in his opinion. So he's going to manage this scandal the best he can to his advantage. So we have all these suspects. We have a high-profile director murdered, and the case really goes nowhere. There isn't a lot of physical evidence, very little circumstantial evidence, and only a few eyewitnesses. The only eyewitnesses include an attendant at a local gas station who says a man came that afternoon and asked for directions to William Desmond Taylor's apartment. They didn't remember much about him. There's a neighbor across from Taylor's apartment named Faith McLean. They were also friends. She said about 8 o'clock, the time of the murder, she saw a strange-looking man around William Desmond Taylor's front door. She can't recall what made him look strange, except he looked strange. He looked like a typical movie crook, in her opinion, and said he might have been wearing heavy movie makeup to disguise himself. At 8 o'clock, she and her husband heard what they at first thought was a shot, but then attributed to an auto backfire. And the only other circumstantial evidence is that Taylor's bank accounts seemed really low for a man who was making such a great salary, and that he seemed really troubled a few days before the murder. He would get phone calls at the studio, only to have the caller hang up. So this led police to believe that he was being blackmailed, possibly. So, now despite the fact that the case really goes nowhere with the police, the press had a field day. And they all have their favorite suspects. So a lot of them suspect Henry Peavy, probably because he's black. Some suspect Mary Miles Minter, some Mabel and her. Actually, let me go back just a little bit. Mabel had just recently kicked a cocaine habit, and with Taylor's help. And while they rule her out as a suspect, they think it's possible that one of her cocaine pushers eliminated Taylor because he had vowed that anybody who got Mabel rehooked on drugs would answer to him. So the press speculates about that. Maybe it was Mabel, one of Mabel's cocaine dealers. Edward Snyder, former butler, is a possibility. And Charlotte Shelby remains a favorite target of the press. But despite all this, nothing really happens. At one point, a reporter who firmly believes that Henry Peavy is the suspect tries to get somebody dressed as a ghost to scare him into confession. Well, the guy wearing the sheet has this coarse Chicago accent. Taylor has slight British inflection. Henry Peavy starts laughing at him when he starts talking, so the guy just is so humiliated he runs off. So the case really goes nowhere. It kind of starts to become a dead case. Fast forward 15 years to 1937. Charlotte Shelby Mary Miles Minter, her daughter, and another daughter named Margaret Shelby, all get in a big family feud. Margaret gets drunk and calls up a reporter and says, "Hey, my mother killed William Desmond Taylor. Do you want the story?" Of course, the reporter wants the story. They run with it. So now the DA has no choice but to interview her. The previous DA had kind of softballed her. You know, he had declined to interview her or question her. A lot of people believe it was under pressure from the movie studio. And it's also possible he was having a relationship with Mrs. Shelby and didn't want that to come out. But the new DA has no choice but to question her. So she is questioned, and her chauffeur at the time is questioned. And he tells the DA that she had a small caliber weapon. There were some rare bullets that I took out of it. A rare slug killed William Desmond Taylor. She had threatened William Desmond Taylor, and then she threw the gun on the swamp. So they bring Charlotte Shelby in for questioning. She goes, "Yeah, I threw a gun in the swamp. I had the chauffeur take the bullets out. I threatened William Desmond Taylor, but I was so concerned for my daughter, I didn't want the gun around because I thought she'd kill herself." And then she says, "Well, I was with another man at the time of the murder, and this man who claims he was with Mrs. Shelby gave her an alibi." And the DA believes her, or at least says there's not enough evidence to prosecute her. And the case then goes cold. Now the DA made it plain that he wanted all evidence preserved in the case. In a few years it all disappears. And inexplicably. Now, everything I've kind of told you till now has been kind of agreed upon by most scholars and historians, bloggers, but the author kind of has his own theory of what happened. He said that when the studio people went into the apartment right after Taylor's death, they found letters from Mabel, they found letters from Mary Miles Minter that they removed, but they also found letters from another person. And had this been made public, it would have made a scandal bigger than many others. There were letters from a young man named George Hopkins. He was a scene designer. He'd worked with William Desmond Taylor, and the letters indicate they were in an intimate relationship. Well, I mean, had this gotten out in 1922, this would have given the anti-movie people even more fodder for their cause. So, probably at the direction of Zucker, these letters were removed and destroyed. And it's likely that the studio started planning stories about Charlotte Shelby, Henry Peavy, Mary Miles Minter, Edward Snyder, anything to just throw the authorities off the trail of this George Hopkins Taylor romance. So he thinks that secret may have been what have led to Taylor's murder. So the case grows cold again after that. And all the people connected to the case start to kind of die or fade away. Henry Peavy passes away in 1931 of complications from syphilis. Mabel Norman passes away in 1930 at the age of 37 from TB. And one of her last remarks was, "I wonder if they'll ever find who killed poor Billy Taylor." Mary Miles Minter never makes another movie after Desmond Taylor's death. And she retires from films. She is married for a while, and she's able to live quite well off her movie earnings and the investments that her mother made. She eventually passes away in 1984 at the age of 82. But she's kind of like Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard. She kind of relives her movie star past when she's in the movie. Edward Snyder, the butler, they never find him. He's kind of lost to history. And Margaret Gibson, who people later consider a suspect, she retires from the movies. She never gets to be the big movie star that she hopes to be. She marries an oil executive, and they live around the world, and he gets killed during World War II over in the South Pacific. He's not in the service, but he's in the oil industry. George Hopkins, the scenic designer, goes on to win 4 Oscars for his work in movies. And Adolf Zucker, a crazy, paranoid movie mogul. He doesn't get to be the most powerful man in Hollywood, but he comes pretty close. His studio, famous players Lasky, morphs into Paramount. And he's able to steer Paramount through the Great Depression, not a small feat. They become a major studio. And he finally is the one that is instrumental in establishing the production code. The movie imposes its own code where certain things are not acceptable in movies. And they appoint Will Hayes, former Postmaster General, as the code czar. And this sort of prevents the government censorship because they're all so scared of. Zucker goes on to live to be 103 when he passes away in 1976, and he's recognized as a pioneer in the film industry. So those are all the major players. Now the author says, decades later, years after this happened, somebody confesses to the murder of William Desmond Taylor. Any ideas who it might be? Any guesses? Any ideas? Want me to tell you?
Yes.
Well, in Los Angeles, there's this older lady. She lives in relative poverty and obscurity, and one day a neighbor invites her over to watch TV. And they're watching TV, and the documentary comes on about the murder of William Desmond Taylor. This is in the 60s. And this lady starts to get, goes into hysterics, and collapses with a heart attack. And as they're hauling her away, she makes a deathbed confession. I was involved in the murder of William Desmond Taylor. So after she dies, the neighbors go into the house and they see evidence that she was indeed a movie star in the silent era. It was Margaret Gibson, who supposedly made a deathbed confession. Now, I don't think she wasn't the murderer, but she was involved in some pretty shady schemes. I think I put that on the sheet. When she couldn't make it as an actress, she was involved in blackmail, extortion with 3 other people. And I think one of these men is the one that pulled the trigger on Taylor. They went there to shake him down. They think she knew about the romance with George Hawkins. And that's what led to it. That's kind of brief, but any other questions?
Good job.
Pardon?
Good job.
Thank you. Which is an interesting book. Anybody ever heard of this case before that read this book? I mean, if you get on here, there's a lot about it. A lot of different theories. Not everybody goes to the Margaret Gibson theory.
Is the book you mentioned, was it The Day of the Locust?
By Nathaniel West.
Is that about the con men ring, or?
Well, no, it's fictional, and it's set about a decade later. But it has a lot of the same stuff. I mean, it's sort of the same feel. You have con man, grifters, that sort of thing.
What was that book?
Day of the Locust.
Oh.
I think it was a movie in the 70s. Donald Sutherland, Karen Black, I think, were the stars. Kind of disturbing. A little bit like Chinatown, had the same feel as Chinatown, which I think was set in the 40s. Any other questions? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot on here that I've never read before. And the Fatty Arbuckle case is really interesting. There's an interesting book, I think it's called 412, that's the hotel room where the alleged assault took place. And it goes into a lot of depth about that case. Really awful.
Well, thank you very much.